Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Nafs and Therapy Season 3. Now, this season is all about when Islamic knowledge and mental health meet. We're hosting Islamic scholars to bring the tradition into the conversation with our inner worlds, so that religion isn't just reduced to pressure or to performance, and that therapy is not detached from meaning. Together, we're going to explore how the Quran, ethics, and lived practice can offer us clarity, steadiness, and a more merciful way of being with ourselves on the road back to Allah. Now, a quick disclaimer. This episode is just for reflection and education. It's definitely not a substitute for personal therapy, medical care, or formal fatwa. If anything brings up something tender for you, please reach out to the right professional. And today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Adnan Zulfiqar, who is an interdisciplinary scholar, a professor at Boston College Law School, and his work bridges Islamic law and ethics with a focus on questions of responsibility and authority, which shape how we live. So, Bismillah. I just want to reiterate on how blessed and happy and honored I am to have you on this podcast and on Season 3. Inshallah.
Thank you. It's very kind of you. I'm blessed to be invited and to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you. And throughout the previous seasons, I've invited a lot of therapists, a lot of mental health practitioners. And this season, I'm so keen on inviting folks like you whose work is very much centralized around not just the spiritual and esoteric sides of Islam, but more towards the law, towards the sides of Islam that we don't have very accessible content for the lay Muslim to just read or listen or know more about, to know their internal world. So it would be lovely if you can tell us a bit what made you choose the major you've chosen, this career, this path.
Yeah, so I mean it's that is probably a longer story than you'd want, but I'll give you the condensed version of it. I have always been fascinated by religion and Islam, obviously, in particular. But even growing up, I grew up for a period of time in my early years. I was here in the US, but then in Eastern Africa, in Kenya. And I grew up there. And you know, there was people from all over the world there, but also people of different faiths. And so religion in general was very interesting to me. The idea of salvation was very interesting to me as a little kid, mainly because I was curious about questions like, would this wonderful teacher of mine who is not Muslim, would she go to heaven? Would she go to hell? How was this possible one way or the other, right? So those type of questions always animated my early years. And then just kind of growing up and seeing
Mhm.
Islam as it was lived by my parents, my mother in particular, for whom I saw it as a lived experience. For my father, it was, he was wonderful as an intellectual interlocutor, someone who I could have open discussions with and questioning discussions with without kind of him sort of shutting me down. I think that just grew. And then, when I went to college, I decided, to be a religion and anthropology major, but the plan was that I would go on to become a doctor. So I did pre-med and all of that as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I did all of that until my sort of my third year, junior year in college. I just realized I loved the idea in medicine of helping people. And I have a
Mm.
tremendous respect for doctors, for the kind of role they play in our society. But the path to get there was not one that I was particularly passionate about or that kind of stirred my intellect or anything like that. I found myself in my science classes not asking the curious questions the way some of my classmates would, but I found myself asking those questions in my philosophy or my religion or my history classes. And I realized that it was something where, at the end of the day, and it's not to say that everyone who goes to medicine is going to ask those questions, but for me, it was an important part of the learning journey. And so at that point, I sort of broke the news to my parents. But I realized initially I was like, oh, I need to have a backup professional degree so that they won't be too upset. So I said, I think I'm going to do law. And it
Hmm.
was because at that stage, it just seemed to make sense. I had worked as a assistant at the law school. And so I thought maybe this is a place where some of the questions will fascinate me as well. And it turned out that it was. So that's how I got on the path. And then when I was applying to law schools, before I applied to law schools, I spent some time overseas studying
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
Syria, and then I studied in Pakistan. And it was very intense study, oftentimes one on one with different teachers on different subjects because I was trying to condense a lot in while I had the opportunity. And then, alhamdulillah, like I enjoyed it. It was great, to study everything, full of fiqh, like all those things. Obviously, Arabic, Farsi, some Urdu. And so when I came back and I started law school, I realized that I did not want to let this path go. And that's when I then also applied for the PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies. And so that just set me on the path to do both. And I felt like I wanted to do both because, in some respects, there was a need to, on a scholarly level,
Hmm.
translate this immense, sophisticated Islamic legal tradition into a language that was similarly sophisticated and academic and accessible. While at the same time, there was also this need for Muslims themselves to have a sense of the sophistication of their tradition, even in its simplicity, right? So like
Right.
is oftentimes when you dig into it, you realize that through a sophisticated understanding, you understand how simple Islam is.
Mm.
It's we sometimes lose kind of what we pass off as sophistication to just complicate the faith, right?
Mm.
And we do it in ways that are ahistorical, so not really accurate historically, or we'll do it in ways that even the ulama did not in the past. But we will sort of add layer upon layer upon layer on the faith in a way that I think is not only damaging to the simplicity of it, but is not actually as sophisticated as people think.
Yeah, as you're talking, I had like 10,000 questions at the same time. But one
Sure.
of them is if you'd like to elaborate a bit more about like what do you think is like the over sophistication of the simplicity? What's behind that?
Yeah, I would say it's the overcomplication, right? So
Yeah.
it gets into one of those. Let me give you an example, right? Like when let's say you purchase a toy for your child at the store, and it's a bigger toy, or let's say you purchase some kind of like item from the store and there's like an instruction manual there with it. Oftentimes you'll rarely sit down and read the whole instruction manual, right? You will get to the essence of it and then you will be like, oh, okay, this is how this thing works. And when you read the rest of the instruction manual, they're using a lot of words, etc., but it's not particularly sophisticated in explaining to you how exactly this thing works, what the mechanics are behind it, etc. It's just giving you kind of rote instructions, you know, how to do this, then you do that. If this happens, here's some troubleshooting things, etc. So it's a lot of language, but it doesn't necessarily make you appreciate, wow, like this thing is so simple, but look at what's behind it, right? And I think that's oftentimes what we do with a lot of Islam as well,
Mm.
where the faith itself is simple, and it has to be because this immense legal tradition that was created didn't exist at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And it didn't
Mm-hmm.
exist for at least a few hundred years, right? What did exist at that time was the legal tradition in sort of a simpler way, in a more straightforward way, without kind of the layers and layers and layers that have been developed. And those layers, mind you, are beautiful and amazing,
Mhm.
when they're properly appreciated as individuals, scholars, ulama, using all the tools at their disposal to access the most accurate understanding of Islamic law at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right?
Mm, mm,
At the time of the Prophet himself, like the tradition was Islamic law was straightforward, basic, because you had the ultimate authority there to sort of let you know, like, hey, okay, you don't need to worry about that. Or this is sort of an area that you should focus on, or here's advice about this or that. When you've lost that, then the rest of the Islamic sort of legal tradition since then is just trying to find ways in which to get
mm,
back to that as best they can, as closely as they can.
mhm,
What we've run into, though, is something that happens with a lot of faith traditions or other even ideologies, is that we have fallen into this trap, which you might say is better safe than sorry, or a trap which basically says, let's create the harder, the more complicated I can make the deen, that's got to be as close to the
mm,
prophet as in terms of accuracy. That, oh, the more complicated, the more rigid, the closer it is to the authentic, because religion has to be very hard. It has to be complicated. If it's easy, everyone would be able to do it, right?
mm,
That's, I
mm,
think, the mentality. I would say it's a modern mentality, in
mm,
particular, that has ended up kind of dominating our frame. And one could say that it's impacted by the colonial experience that Muslims had. Like, if you look at some of the individuals, the Muslim intellectuals that really sort of have influenced the modern period the most, like they're coming out of a colonial period, they're very responsive to the sort of end of Muslim dominion and the beginning of Muslim subjugation
mm,
from a sort of political level. And so the rigidity in some respects is natural there as well. But even when you dig into those folks, like a Maulana Maududi or others who are like conservative in terms of, or rigid in certain things, if you dig into their works, you realize like there's actually more sophistication there than they've been credited for, and even more flexibility than they've been credited for, but you just have pulled certain things. I would say the same things, even Sayyid Qutb and others uh, who exist in that world, that post-colonial world of kind of we have to fortify Islam in certain ways.
There's a question that I feel I wanted to maybe preamp this with, and it's how can we actually apply the Islamic law when most of us live in countries that are not actually like Sharia-based countries or countries that are operating within a Muslim system? So,
Mhm.
does this mean that us as individuals need to have a certain understanding of this without, even if it's not applicable like by an institution?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first 10 years, decade so of Islam, like there was no Islamic state, right? You
Mm,
still had principles, values, ideas core to Islam that people live their life by, but there was no state per se to
mm,
institute any rules, etc. And
right.
only in Medina is when you begin to then, even within the Quran, begin to get laws about administering a state. So there's a couple things that are important. The first is this sort of, in some respects, modern notion that has been promoted where the idea that you cannot fully live a Muslim life without the authority of the state helping to craft a more Muslim society for you, right?
Mm,
Like this idea that we need an Islamic state in order to live a life under Islamic law, right? That philosophy, which big names, Yusuf Qaradawi, others have put forward in their lifetimes, others have put that, this is what needs to exist because that's how you will have the context, the sort of circumstances that will allow you to live the best Muslim life you can under Islamic law, etc. There's not much basis for that from,
Mm,
I would say, the Islamic legal tradition. Yes, as a default for hundreds of years, Muslims were sort of in the ruling sort of establishment. They were the one, Islamic law was kind of the law of the land. So many scholars didn't really have to think about it, but that wasn't the case everywhere. And for a lay person, the guidance that they are required to follow is not necessarily reliant on whether the state is imposing certain like laws with regard to like criminal law or
mm,
other things, because you sort of, as long as you have some choice in the matter, if you have the ability to pray, if you have the ability to fast, if you have the ability to learn your faith, to teach it to the next generation, if you have the ability to carry out your own funerals. Like, there are certain obligations that are on you as a Muslim individual that you can fulfill regardless of what the sort of governing authority is, as long as they give you freedom in these spaces, right? In these spaces. Right now, in theory, would you say under a Muslim run state, maybe things would be easier or better? You could be more Muslim, maybe, but I'm not
mm,
sure that the current state of the world suggests that one way or the other, right? Like, people look, there'll oftentimes be this argument that, like, oh, we don't really have any Islamic states today. Okay, go read Islamic history. Tell me when we had them, right?
mm,
In that perfect way that you imagine. Tell me when we had them. And you'll see it's just like maybe two handfuls that you'll be able to point to as the. Otherwise, you had rulers who were doing all types of un-Islamic things. You had, polities that were doing things that were outside of the Sharia, like, and you had a decentralized society. So oftentimes the center was not as much of a concern for the average Muslim. What the caliph was up to wasn't necessarily much of a concern to the average Muslim because it wasn't impacting your life beyond kind of, you got to pay your taxes, your
mm,
zakat, etc., things along those lines. And you have to make sure you have to abide by law and order. So in some
mm,
respects, like, you're not dealing with major circumstances that are a lot different. People imagine that like there was no zina going on, like, ever.
mm,
Like, oh, that's not like, it's not the reality. There's a reason that even punishments regarding zina were created at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because these things, sort of ways in which human beings transgress, have existed throughout. But the obligations that you need to fulfill as a Muslim, the core obligations, the
mhm,
vast majority of them, you could be on an island by yourself and still fulfill them, like, right? Because
right.
Islam is not, it's meant to be eternal. It's meant to be uh, present and be able to exist wherever without condition.
This brings me to this obligation or this taklif. And I think you've spoken about
Mhm.
this in some of your work of what does it mean to be obligated as a Muslim to do something, the sense of moral responsibility. And because I feel like sometimes we struggle so much with this of what's halal, what's haram, what am I supposed to do, and this comes in the way of us a lot of the times, whether doing things that we later on feel guilty about, and the sense of shame, and all. I'll say, like it could go to a very negative spiral, and sometimes it might not. But I would like to like if you have any thoughts on how this sense of obligation impacts this inner life of the person.
Yeah, so I think that, in my view, I think understanding the idea that we as Muslims construct our lives around a paradigm of obligation, of duty, of responsibility is very important. It's very important to sort of understand that from an early age. And in some respects, in Muslim countries, you do simply, you know, just through because the culture sort of see that the culture there is infused with this notion of obligation and taklif, etc., as it relates to others, as it relates to your relationship with Allah Ta'ala, as it relates to society as a whole. The idea of obligation, so there are a couple parts to your question, right? There's this question around, okay, what role does this play? I think that it's an important role in the sense that if you exist in a society understanding that there are things that you owe, it fundamentally changes your perspective versus a society where you are constantly operating with a notion that you are entitled to certain things, right? So, this is the distinction between rights and duties. In a lot of modern societies influenced by the West, where individual rights, which are also very important, kind of dominate the discourse is around, hey, what is it that I am that I'm entitled to? What are my rights? Whether I take them or not, I want to make sure that I have access to them. From an Islamic perspective, a lot of what we are required to do is based on what it is that we owe to Allah Ta'ala, to our creator, and what is it that we owe to, people who are very close to us, and then beyond that to society as a whole. That's how we are structured, right? So if you look at our core obligations, they're really structured around this. You end up doing your salat, you do your salat because this is a obligation, this is something that you owe to Allah. The entity that created you, the entity that is sustaining you, this is this minor thing that you have to give as a in a way of expression of gratitude and subservience, right? Then you look at zakat, which is also something which obviously you owe to Allah Ta'ala, but it's an obligation you owe to others, right? You can only purify your wealth, right? If we look at even the term zakat and the notion of purity, zakat that comes in it, right? You can only purify your wealth that you have, no matter how much of it you do, by giving it away to other people. Like that is an obligation that you will have no matter how much wealth you have. Obviously past like a certain point, right? So that type of obligation. Now, within that there are other obligations that you have which you are obligated to follow the rules, etc. And that there's like the notions of shame and guilt that may come up when you don't, right? But even there, I think we end up focusing on this idea, and it's has less to do with Islam, much more to do with the kind of structure that we've created around Islam, right? And what do I mean by that? We've created this structure, this culture around it where it's like, you were not a perfect Muslim, today you're going to hell, right? I think that what we have to understand, even we understand from like the legal tradition, but even from our earliest period, if you look at like hadith and sort of how the prophet dealt with a lot of things, like there is a constant notion that people are on very different journeys, right? There are some people who are, you see them in public and you think, wow, mashallah, they're like, praying and this and zakat and doing everything, but they're actually on a journey downwards, right? That they're doing many other things which are cutting away at whatever good that they're doing. Like, and we know the famous hadith where someone comes to the prophet, peace be upon him, and says, such and such person is prays all the time and gives zakat and all these things, what is their fate? And the prophet responds, but they say, she's horrible to her neighbors. And the prophet says she'll be in hell, right? Like the response is indicative of the idea that there are certain characteristics that you have to cultivate as a Muslim that are as important as these sort of other rituals that you fulfill. That Islam is not just window shopping, right? Like it's not just putting window dressing on so everyone can see. It's cultivating a what I consider to be a sunnaic or prophetic personality, right? And it's funny, like we recently there was a very famous woman educationalist, thinker who passed away in South Asia, and she used to always say, we have learned the minute details on how to get our wudu right. And yet we end up existing in society as like terrible human beings, as dishonesty is widespread and corruption is
Right.
widespread. What sunnah are we following? Right? Like, so this is, I think, part of that discussion. So, but the last thing I want to say on this, sorry, is the idea that, look, feeling guilt, feeling shame, you should feel those the way you would with anything else as a way to check your behavior. But
Mm,
it should never overwhelm you because Allah Ta'ala recognizes that this may exist when individuals have obligation, etc. And that's why the idea that is present throughout the Quran and literally begins every surah except one is a reminder of God's mercy. And one of the most beautiful verses in the Quran is where Allah Ta'ala is saying, like, just don't despair of turning your face towards me. Like, don't despair of this mercy. And you are reminded of it at the start of every surah in a way where it's not just like, oh, I'm merciful. It is like, it is boundless mercy, right?
mhm,
Now,
mm,
that doesn't mean that you exist then to take advantage of that and be like, oh, I can do whatever I want because Allah Ta'ala is all merciful. No, you're reminded that Allah Ta'ala is just and it's fair and like all these other things that balance it out, but that the mistakes you make in life as it relates to Islam in particular, like God is like all forgiving as long as you're seeking genuinely that forgiveness and seeking to be better. So I think that we unfortunately don't give people pathways back to the
mm,
faith,
mm,
right?
mm, mm,
Don't give people, we just inflict trauma on them for being human and falling off, but we don't find pathways back in for them. And I think and I have a recent story about that, but I'll let you. So, I mean, I recently, this is a little personal, but I recently led the janaza for a dear friend, she was younger than me, childhood friend. Her family, my family grew up together. There were three sisters, and then me and my siblings. They didn't
mm,
have any brothers. I was like, their brother growing up, and loved them dearly. And she passed away, you know, kind of suddenly in her sleep. She'd been battling some things after a head injury, and so it was unexpected. But she, a joyous, wonderful human being. And I remember, like, I was leading the janazah, and there were, non-Muslims there as well, but a lot of Muslims as well, of different levels of practicing the faith. And it was interesting because as I was speaking to them, now their conception of the legal tradition as it relates to the janazah prayer was they're these very rigid sort of things. This is how you have to do it. And that's true. But the ulama have created that, right? Like, it's not necessarily the case that that is exactly how it existed back in the day, and they fully admit that. But like with the different rituals around marriage, etc., we have created some structure to capture the key components that need to be present there, right? The
mhm,
obligation as it relates to people who pass away is, you have to obviously bury them, you wash them, you shroud them, you carry them to the grave, and you also say janazah prayer over them. But the particulars of how exactly you do that, what you're reciting at different points, a lot of those differ based on different ulama, and also are not sort of as set in stone as people imagine. So one of the things that ends up happening there is like, as we're doing this, it's like for so many people, just me saying, hey, listen, like if you don't know the du'as. Or if you don't even know Fatiha, it's okay.
Mhm.
Just speak to Allah Ta'ala in whatever language you
Mhm.
can. Just speak to Allah Ta'ala and pray to Allah Ta'ala for forgiveness for you, for our beloved sister who's passed. Pray for all this. And afterwards, there were so many people who like, and it wasn't a big thing that I did, but it was so many people who were like, "Thank you, you sort of thank you for doing this, like, for making me feel connected here." And, they were like asking, "How can I want to learn more. I want to get back to my faith." But I realized like no one had given them a pathway back. Like it had always been like this inaccessible thing because, oh, like I don't know the dua that you're supposed to say for the deceased, or I don't and so now you're feeling ashamed by that. You're like, and you're sort of you could have two responses. One could be like, "Okay, I'm gonna go home and learn." But for most people, they're like, "Oh, that's too difficult, etc." And so they just drift further away, right?
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate. I mean, other things as well where you're like, look, like our janazas typically in a lot of the Muslim world, they're very quick, right? Like you do it,
Mhm.
you bury, and everyone disperses. There's a dua, everyone disperses. And that's how it is here in the US as well. But our culture in the US is a little different in that, okay, people want a few words at the end, or they want maybe, the loved ones of deceased want to say something for closure, right? They have that
Mm,
requirement.
mm.
And just opening that space up,
Yeah.
for like 5, 10 minutes, it does such a big thing to make, oh, okay, like I have this faith that enriches me, that is like melded within my culture here as well, so that I'm able to sort of we're not diluting Islam in any way, but we're basically doing what has been done over the centuries as well by different
Hmm.
communities that have made the janazah unique in the way that they do it. So when you go to a janazah, when someone passes away, the traditions and rituals around it in Pakistan share similarities with Syria, but also big differences, right?
Mhm.
In terms of how you gather and how you sort of go through that process of mourning and healing. And
Right.
that's what I'm saying is like we have to find pathways back for people so that Islam is not alien to them all the time once they misstep or once they fall off.
Yes, absolutely. I just feel very, like I felt a lot of softness knowing that this small gesture that you've did touched their hearts in a way where they felt like they could at least have some place here. That this is not just
Yeah.
for some people who know Arabic.
Yes, and that ends up being, look, and it was funny because there was, it's- my father afterwards said, oh, in your dua, like you said a few duas in Arabic and then you switched to English, you should say some more duas in Arabic. I said, okay, tell me why. And he said, no,
Mm,
there's like a credibility thing that comes with it. I was like, "Khalas, I'm not interested in that credibility, right?
mm,
Because what I'm interested in is accessibility. And
right.
if I know my entire audience who is sitting there and mourning this beloved person, they don't understand Arabic and they understand bits and pieces of it. So I will give them some because it's part of our liturgy. It is the thing that unites us. Arabic, the language is what unites us in many respects across the globe. But I
Mm.
also want them to hear the message, right?
Mhm.
Like, want what is it that what is the message that Islam has, but also like what are we I want them to understand the du'as that we are saying for the deceased, right? What is it that we're asking for? What is the message that's being sent?
Mm,
And to hopefully take something away from it that brings them a step closer to the faith that maybe they have been away from
mm,
for a while.
And do you think that especially with folks who might be in the faith and then they for whatever reason they might have stepped away or maybe just found something that is less demanding because I think if we want to really be fair there's some demand that it comes with being a Muslim whether it
Mhm.
was your prayer, whether it was your zakat, whether it was not doing certain things. And I'm wondering if you see that stepping away from the religion is stepping away from those responsibilities.
Yeah, for some people, that may be the case, right? But I would argue that even there at times, and again, it varies in different places, but let me give you the example of Pakistan and prayer, right?
Hmm.
In Pakistan, idea of prayer that is taught to young people is that every prayer, not only are there the fard that you have to say, but in if you are going to be praying Dhuhr, you need to do like 4 sunnah before and 2 sunnah, and like that you construct, like you make prayer, which is the fard, which is simple, right? And really, like even the ulama that I studied with were like, do the fard and 2 sunnah afterwards, alhamdulillah,
Mm,
except for like fajr. But and that these are like ulama that I studied with in Syria and other places, right? But in Pakistan, for instance, they construct so much that now even saying your salat becomes like a whole endeavor.
mm,
And if you don't do it, then it's like, oh, you didn't really do it properly, right? So
mm.
we create such barriers for people to actually fulfill their responsibilities, right?
Right.
It's one of and we make barriers where we're like, okay, you have to like you have to say every salat at the masjid, or you have to, okay, those are good things. Those are like great things to do. But man, just get into the habit of saying it. But more importantly, how you thinking about salat.
Mm,
It's not that, some people are like, oh, you have to get khushu in every prayer. It's impossible. Like even the greatest scholars, that is, they may tell you that, but that's just not humanly possible. They may get it a lot, but it's just not humanly possible.
mm-hmm,
What is it that you're really trying to do there? And
mm-hmm,
my solution for that with my son, I remember there was a point where we were at an event and we were about to say Maghrib before we
mm-hmm,
entered. And he was playing with his friends and he was young. He was maybe like 7, 6, 7, something like that. And he was playing with his friends and I asked him, I said, I asked him, hey, we're about to pray. Can you come join? And I was reluctant to do that because I didn't want to juxtapose go play with your friends and prayer, right?
oh,
But
yeah.
I wanted him to come and join. So I said, "Just come join me, Baba, and I will tell you afterwards why." Right?
Mm,
Because we were just about to start the prayer. So he did, he came, he joined. And afterwards I said to him, I said, "Listen, Allah Ta'ala misses your presence, right? Allah Ta'ala misses talking to you. And all he's asking is that 5 times during the day, you just come and you sit and you talk to him for like 5 minutes, if that." And, for my son, it was interesting. I said, "That's it. Go play. I just wanted to tell you that Allah misses your presence." And it was interesting because we were at a wedding like a year later or something. And out of nowhere, I didn't know where he was, but out of nowhere, I see him run and come and stand next to me. And as the prayer was starting, we finished praying. I was like, Baba, where did you come from? I was like, you came in to pray. He's like, yeah, I remember what you told me. And I hadn't talked to Allah in a while, right? I think we have to look to convey to our children and even to our adults that prayer is the opportunity to be in conversation with the creator, whether you're hearing them back or not, but to be there to both express gratitude, but just to reignite that relationship,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
And I think
mm-hmm,
so many times, and it doesn't mean that it isn't a habit. Of course, prayer is a habit. You have to develop it as a habit. But continuing to remind ourselves that, man, like, it is a moment for you to just pause and be in conversation with Allah Ta'ala. That makes the responsibility a very different one. It makes
right.
the burden a very different one. So, what I'm saying is like, yes, of course, Islam has a lot of responsibilities, and people will be like, hey, I'd rather have a carefree life than have all these responsibilities. But the truth of the
Right.
matter is, I think that we have made the responsibilities more burdensome than they need to be. We have not framed them properly for people. And everything suggests that the carefree life is actually not the fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm.
People, even people who have the opportunity to be completely carefree, they want something that anchors them to the ground, right? There's a famous book called The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera, right?
Yeah.
It's it talks within it about this notion that you want to be anchored. And we just have to help people understand that Islam is the anchor, and it's not as burdensome of an anchor as it might have
Mm.
been suggested by others.
Right. And while you're studying Sharia,
Mhm,
while you were doing your studies, did you have moments of, okay, this doesn't make sense to me? Like this, like I don't necessarily agree with this or feel like this sits well with me, but I'll still I'll take this as a whole and take it with a grain of salt and move on with my life. The reason why I'm asking is sometimes I notice there are some wounds that people might experience with
mhm,
the religion, whether it was like I had some trouble with my divorce or with the inheritance or with certain things that are very much related to certain rules or clauses. And of course, rules apply differently in different countries. But I'm wondering if you had the like how would you approach someone who's struggling with those wounds that they feel are inflicted by the religion itself?
right. So I think there are couple ways in which that comes up, right? So there are certain rules that you're saying that end up being inflicted by sort of our understanding of the faith, and you inheritance, marriage, these are places where it comes potentially up. And then there are other things which, life happens and you think, wow, this is so unfair to me. Like, how could
Mm-hmm.
Allah do this to me? Like, I've been such a good Muslim, etc. Right? So those ones, I think that the latter ones, and in general, I think that teaching and having understanding of what tawakkul means and what it means to sort of have faith that throughout your life you draw the sketch, but Allah Ta'ala makes the plan.
Mm-hmm.
You sketch out what it is that you want, but your faith is that Allah Ta'ala is putting you on a path and a plan that is going to be best for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for that, you have to really suppress your ego because you have to be able to deal with failure. You have to be able to deal with rejection. You have to be able to deal with the idea that you are not going to get what you want all the time. And not only deal with it, you have to accept that as actually being best for you, right? And oftentimes when people do that, one, I think they're confirmed in that they dodged a bullet, they thought they loved someone, but it turned out that person wasn't as good as they thought, etc., right? So that's one component. Then there are these things which, as you noted, they feel like the religion is inflicting them on you. And yeah, throughout my study of Islam, like there have been different points where I've come across things where I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, I don't think this doesn't feel right. It doesn't sit right. And my solution to that is to continue to study, to engage, to question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've been fortunate, blessed to have amazing teachers along the way. Some a little more rigid than others, right? Where questions were a little harder to ask, but still beneficial. But I remember spending one period where there was like a week where I was debating two hadith with my teacher the whole week, just back and forth because it didn't make sense to me. They didn't
Wow.
sort of um they felt like they were off from the prophet's character. There were a lot of things that didn't sit right. And we just went back and forth until we got to a place where I was like, okay, that satisfies me enough for now. I'll explore it later, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that people have to, if you feel like the inheritance laws are not working in your favor, or It shouldn't be. Now, there's one thing where you think they're not working in your favor. There's another thing where you think they're unfair.
Right.
Inheritance laws may not work in your favor because that's what's fair. But if you think that they're unfair within
Hmm.
sort of the scheme of Islam as a whole, then you should dig into that. You should see what have different scholars said. There's no like uniformity on it. There are different opinions, right? Especially in certain parts. But you have to understand, for instance, inheritance law cannot be understood without understanding the broader framework of responsibility that Islam has set up, as in how certain responsibilities fall on certain men within the family with regard to caretaking, with regard of parents, etc. What the structure is around the bridal gifts, the meher that's given as well.
Hmm.
The financial structure in Islam is holistic. It's not, if you just pick one piece of it without understanding other parts of it, it becomes very difficult to sort of fully appreciate what wisdom might be behind that. But that said, the inheritance laws, as they're articulated to you in a particular country or by a particular sheikh, may not be the only articulation of that, of inheritance laws, right? So
Right.
knowledge is key, right? You cannot sort of think, oh, I am not as learned as such and such sheikh who spent years studying the faith, etc. You should have deference and respect for that. But that doesn't mean that you can't go out and utilize your intelligence, your access to materials and sources, and your access to other shuyukh to try to get an answer that helps you understand the faith better. And it may be that in the end you arrive at the same place, right?
Hmm.
But that journey of understanding will keep you, I think, within the bounds of the faith much more than you just dismissing, oh, this is unfair. Like, you know, I reject Islam as a result. You have to take on some agency to learn.
Right. And you think that because since a lot of we have a lot of like laws, a lot of like very detailed descriptions that are just like they're profound every time I read the verses. Like,
Mhm.
wow, Rabbil Alamin was so detailed in describing, for example, certain equations and all of that. And I sometimes hear the opposition or this defensiveness of how is this applicable in our time right now, where there are changes, whether in roles or in family structures and all of that. And I would love to hear from you on this applicability of even just not just the inheritance, but in so many other elements that we take as is and we want to apply in our lives.
Yeah. Right. So, but if you look, even for instance, in the details within, let's say, for instance, the details on how the breakup is of inheritance laws, right? Certain things are clear, but those fractions that are created, like there are numerous ways in which people have tried to break it down and understand it. The Hanafis understand it a little bit different than the Malikis that understand. It's the same verses, right? But different scenarios come up, different things in which they're thinking through that. So that's just to say that, like, it's not to say that everything is up for interpretation or say, no, it's that is the human endeavor when you're engaging with the divine text without a divinely inspired interpreter present in your life in the prophet, right?
Hmm.
We are always going to be limited in some respects there, right? And so that's only to suggest that there is a lot of thinking through these different rules, etc., that come up. But your question about what about applicability? We live in a different time. People have different roles. And like, let's
Hmm.
be straightforward, right? We're talking about roles of women and men in particular, like relationships within the family, all of that, like wife, husband, who works, who doesn't, all these things, right? One is first, like some of those dynamics existed in the past as well, right? And it's funny because we sort of obviously we know that Sayyidah Khadija, and sort of her role as a businesswoman, but then even just in terms of the sort of boldness of women in the early period to ask questions, to grab the prophet by the elbow and have a like, to feel completely empowered to do that, right, is very different in some respects than how we have constructed society today. That's only to say that I don't want us to necessarily get caught up in the idea that, "Oh, that time was very different than this time." Yes, of course it
Mhm.
was, but there may be lessons of sort of empowerment even from the prior times that are just lessons that we don't study history enough, so they get kind of removed, right? But I think that within the faith itself, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility as it relates to adapting to the present day, right? So and some of that is flexibility, which comes from understanding the faith better. For instance,
Mhm.
the idea, let's just take some common ones. I don't know if these are the ones that are of concern to you, right? But common ones around, oh, can women work? Can women go to get educated? Like,
Mhm.
all these things, right? There are no limitations that come up anywhere on those things. A woman has to do like housework. There's nothing around that as an obligation for women at all, right?
Mhm.
Like we've
Mhm.
defaulted into some of these roles, but there's nothing around that. And in fact, like if you look at the prophet's life himself, like he's doing a lot of things, cleaning the home, etc., that men today would consider below them. Or like if you go to the Muslim world, it'd be like it's I'm just in this sort of masculine role. But that has nothing to do with Islam.
Right, right.
We have taken certain things as cultural norms, which again, one can investigate those norms as correct or not, whatever else. We've taken them as norms and we've applied them as though they are strict, rigid limitations that the faith has, right? And the challenge becomes when a society applies that as a whole, then anyone who sort of bucks that trend a little bit or does something a little different is now like, oh, they're straying from the faith. When in
Mm.
fact, like, the faith doesn't have that limitation. They're just straying from the sort of
Mm.
culture that you have set up, right? So
Right.
all these things, like so we Islam historically has never had an issue, for instance, with women getting educated, that now, like, the Taliban has put all these, like, strictures on. Like, where? Like, women were creating the first universities in the world in
Mm.
North Africa, right? So, like, that is never knowledge, for instance, access to knowledge. We've had women ulama throughout. If you look, for instance, at, Muhammad Akram al-Nadawi in London, who he was trying to address this question around women scholars, and he said, "Okay, I'm just gonna dip into this to show some examples of how we've had women ulama, etc." He ended up filling like I think it's a 12-volume book, right?
Wow.
And it's just because no one had peeked in to do work there. So he's now has this 12-volume book in I believe it's in Arabic, in on sort of women scholars that have existed who were narrating hadith to even some of our most famous ulama, right? So there are parts of our history that are just lost to us along those lines. So
Right.
with all of that though, what I think the key is for anybody who is asking those questions and who's talking about applicability is understand, study your faith more. Don't just
Mhm.
be, and here's something which may be controversial for folks. Don't just be stuck on one teacher.
Right, right,
Don't
yeah,
just be
yeah.
stuck on one teacher. Look and find other teachers, right? There are amazing teachers out there, and you don't have to have just one. You can learn from multitudes of people, right? If
Mhm.
that is the route that you want. If you just want one teacher, okay, alhamdulillah, that's for you, that's fine. But I would not just say, hey, like, this person understands Islam and this is the only definitive understanding of Islam. I have to just accept that as Islam or say that I don't accept Islam.
Mhm,
Those aren't
mhm.
the 2 options. I would tell you I have and I'm a lowly very low on the totem pole, but I have
Yeah.
disagreement with some of the major ulama that exist today.
Mhm.
And those disagreements are grounded in, like, scholarly stuff, is grounded in what they have made in certain interpretive decisions that I think are incorrect, right? Now,
Mhm.
like, I'm humble enough to understand that, like, they know far more than me, so maybe I'm mistaken, maybe I'm probably mistaken, right? But
Mm.
I've relied on other scholars who have helped inform kind of that opinion for me, or I've dug into the Islamic legal tradition and have gone back and read other stuff to say, oh, I don't think this is quite an accurate way of understanding this, right?
Mm,
I'm not saying that the average Muslim needs to dig that deep. But
right.
now, with the type of communications we have and the access to information and your ability to access scholars from anywhere in the world, there's literally never been a time period like this in all
Yeah.
of history for Muslims to be able to access information about their faith to lead them to a better understanding of it. And in the next some years, you're going to end up having access to that information through like artificial intelligence as well, which will give you access to even more information, right? Um,
Right.
Obviously, one has to look for the accuracy, make sure it's credible, etc. Not just, there's a difference between seeking to understand and seeking to get the answer that you want.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are two very
Absolutely.
different things. If you
Mm,
approach the journey with a sincerity to actually just understand, that will be more liberating than you can imagine, even if you end up with a position that is not the one that you wanted, right?
yeah. That's a huge, that's such a good as well, like wrap of the whole session right now of just being able to look and take in what you can get as an answer, even if it doesn't, even if it's not what you want as an answer, which is such a courageous way to look into things. And that's why scientists
Yeah.
sometimes say like creating their same hypotheses over and over and over because they're looking at one direction.
Yeah. And
Oh,
it's what I tell my children is like Allah Ta'ala answers all your prayers, but sometimes the
mm,
answer is no.
right. And sometimes we don't accept the no.
You don't
Like we,
accept the no. Yeah,
yeah.
and what you have to believe is it's not like the no that your parents are necessarily giving you or your teachers. It's a no that is rooted in absolutely your best interests, right? Parents are, I think, oftentimes when they say no, that's also what it's rooted in. But when you're talking about Allah, like when you're talking about your creator, the answer is rooted in your best interests, and you just have to
Mm,
accept that. I think what I've found in the modern period is in our societies is coming to terms with the fact that there is a
mm,
wisdom that is greater than your
mm,
own and
if,
that
mm,
surpasses human wisdom. And that is oftentimes one of the biggest challenges. I remember being in a class in Syria and it was all foreigners. We were part of sort of Kulliyat al-Adab in Damascus University and we were having these discussions and one of the Syrian teachers who was Muslim, we were reading an Arabic novel and discussing it in Arabic and she basically turned to me and was like, Adnan, like, explain why is this like this in Islam? Like, or what there's something that happened within the novel and everyone is distressed about it. And they wanted an explanation from Islam. And I said, look, I can provide you an explanation, but you have to understand that my starting point and your starting point are different, right? My
mm,
starting point is that I am in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding with a acknowledgement that there are limits to what I can know and there's limits to my wisdom. And you're not starting from that standpoint, right? At least the people in that room. You're
mm,
starting from there's nothing inaccessible to me, right? Except for the limitations of me as, I'm not smart enough, but that's it, right? And I was like, we're fundamentally beginning in different places. So I can only take you so far
mm,
till a point where our understanding of the world diverges in such a way that, I'm not sure we will overcome that because you can't appreciate the notion that there is a divine wisdom that extends beyond the human realm.
mm. And that by itself can be such a groundbreaking realization for someone to just sit with that it
Yeah,
can just take acceptance. And that's what we try to do in therapy, and a lot of times to accept what we can't change. But the difference here
yeah,
is to know that it's not just like something random that's happening. It's Rabbil Alameen's wisdom.
yeah. There's wisdom, there's there's purpose and structure and meaning
Mm,
to what's happening in your life. And look, like, yeah, of course, they're challenging things. We look at everything that's happening in Gaza, for instance, and we
mm,
think, yeah, Allah, like, what's the wisdom there? What is the sort of, what could possibly be? But, we don't have to go much further than the people in Gaza who have tawakkul and who have this level of sort of acceptance
mm,
that is just beyond anything we can imagine, right? That even in the darkest of moments, you see people who are accepting, okay, this is part of some plan. We don't understand it, and there's so much pain here, but this is part of some plan, and we submit, right?
yeah.
And I'm not saying that's everybody in Gaza, obviously, right? Like there's human beings are different, they go through, but the sort of this overwhelming sentiment there, or if you look at other situations as well.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we sort of stop in those cases or in our own lives working for a better world or working for a
Mm,
better condition or trying to achieve, or if you have a particular goal and you fail at it one time, you don't just accept, okay, I'm a failure, that's Allah's plan. No, Allah wants you to maybe try again, right? Or maybe
right.
like go through the adversity to be a stronger person at the end. So I think it doesn't remove your agency, but it empowers you in a way to understand, like, okay, this is just one misstep in the journey. And by the way, Muslims are not unique in this.
Hmm.
See, like Christians have this viewpoint, like, many Christian athletes that you see, they sort of, that's how they approach all the sort of things that have happened in their life that have held them back. And they use that as motivation to be better and stronger the next time.
Right. I probably dodged so many questions that I would have loved to ask as well, but this was such a rich and meaningful conversation with you, Dr. Adnan. And
I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share my musings with you. And,
mm,
and these are important conversations to, I think, have as well, just as we as we try to navigate these waters of being Muslim and trying to be true and authentic within the faith, to what extent, like, we access or have
mm,
knowledge of our legal tradition and our tradition in general to help in that endeavor, I think is really important, and hopefully it can inspire some folks to dig deeper.
yeah, I think that's there's one takeaway from this is to go, to explore, to put yourself like get your hands dirty with what's available to you, and of course with the teacher. And
Right.
inshallah, I'm gonna putting in the show links, some links of your own publications and work that are accessible and available if someone wants to take a look.
Sure. And remember, you don't have to just have one teacher. There can be
Yeah.
many. Seek out teachers, read, seek teachers, go YouTube, all that. But, go with an authentic heart. Like, go with a heart that is ready to just learn and not just sort of satisfy your sort of the particular desire that you have. You might end up satisfying that desire, right? Like, but you may be like, oh, I want someone who tells me that I can kind of, have orange juice every day or something like that, right? Like, don't go
Mm,
with that in mind. Go with the notion that you sort of are just trying to understand your faith better, trying to understand what God wants from you better.
mm. Wow. Beautiful, beautiful ending. Thank you so much for your time and for
Welcome.
all the gems that you've shared throughout.